All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our next early edition or early efforts webinar. We will give everyone about a minute or so to log in and get set up, and we'll get started. Thanks so much for being here with us today. Thanks again for joining us. We're having more people logging in, so we'll give everyone just a moment to join our webinar. We appreciate you being here today for our next edition of our Early Efforts webinar series. As you log in, please feel free. You see lots of our friends already jumping into the chat to introduce yourself and share where you are joining us from. It's always lovely to see where our participants are stationed across the country. We'll give everyone about 10 more seconds to log in, and then we'll go ahead and get this started.
We see a lot of familiar names, and welcome to everybody.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, good afternoon. Thanks again for being here for our Early Efforts webinar. Today we are discussing in our topic, If Children Thrive in Equitable Communities, 11 Simple Rules to Help Us to Get There. My name is Lauren Zabinski. I'm Deputy Director for Early Learning Policy here at the Hunt Institute. And for the benefit of anyone who may be joining for us for the first time today, the Hunt Institute is the creation of our founder and our namesake, four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt. We serve as an education policy support to governors, state legislators, and other high-level state elected leaders. We cover the full spectrum of education policy from early childhood through the workforce. In our Early Efforts webinar series, we focus on the early childhood portion of this spectrum and are excited to welcome a terrific panel for discussion today and help us to frame and discuss a framework to help the adults in children's lives establish a new equitable model of working together. We have been really excited for this webinar because not only is the discussion about collaboration and working together, but the actual shape of how the conversation will take place in the webinar will also model that. So it'll be a really great time together. Through this discussion, we'll also touch on how adults interact and how that has a deep and lasting influence on the children and their care, yet how the field pays little attention to these relationships. Noticing this gap, Judy Japlin has pioneered the idea that all adults in a child ecosystem must come together with mutual respect, inclusion, and collaboration to build these communities in which all children thrive. This is the basis for the 11 Simple Rules framework, which helps adults break down silos and dismantle inequitable power structures to ultimately foster high-quality learning in their classroom and beyond. So to understand more about these 11 simple rules, we are joined today by four amazing experts in our field. As I introduce each one, I'm going to pause and give them a moment to jump in and say hi and join our conversation. So first, of course, we have Judy, who's the Executive Director for Leading for Children.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Rachel and Nikki and Nichole, for being such great partners. And I will pass it to Nichole.
Thank you, Judy. Welcome everyone who is joining us virtually, and so pleased to be here with my amazing colleagues and friends, Judy and Rachel and Nikki, and with our partners from the Hunt Institute. So thank you for joining today's conversation, and I'll pass it to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Nichole. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will pass it to you, Nikki.
Hi, everyone. Hello from Laramie, Wyoming. We're so honored to be part of this session today and so happy to be here with our friends from Leading for Children.
Great. Judy, Nichole, Nikki, and Rachel, it's so great to have you with us all today. For All of our participants and friends here are joining us for the webinar. Just a few quick housekeeping, and then we are going to jump right into this conversation. Later in the hour, we will share, we'll have the opportunity actually to open up to some questions from you all as the audience. So you notice at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you have the chat, which we encourage you all to introduce yourself, and we'd love seeing where everyone is from. And as Judy said, some nice familiar names. But you also see a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. Please, as you are listening to discussion and you're hearing the conversation, if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them there in the Q&A, and we will do our best to rise those to the surface and share those with our panel here towards the end of the hour. Also know that today's conversation is closed caption. You can access those settings at the bottom of your screen as well. And finally, we want to let you know that today's webinar will actually be recorded, and we will post it with the Hunt Institute on our YouTube page in the next 2 or 3 days. All right, our goal today is to foster a conversation across colleagues. We mentioned that earlier. We mentioned the importance of collaboration and communication. And so today's conversation will really delve into this sense of fostering a conversation across our colleagues. Therefore, we're going to structure our time together a little bit differently. Rather than posing one question per panelist and rotating through our guests, we're going to pose our questions to the panel as a whole, fostering again that sense of community across the conversation and an understanding on how the 11 simple rules support families and young children. So Judy, to get us started and can you tell us what are the 11 simple rules for thriving communities?
Thank you for that introduction, Lauren, and thanks again, everybody, for your interest and your participation. So I noticed when you said that I pioneered this idea, and I love thinking about pioneering because mostly I think I was inspired with some exasperation. And the embryo of the 11 simple rules happened in Arkansas probably 7 or 8 years ago, when I was with a group of directors and Nichole was one of those audience or participants in the room. And I just felt everyone in the field's frustration at trying to make sense of early learning quality. And the tension around creating what works just was seemingly so impossible. And people were talking about apples and oranges, and there just wasn't harmony, and there wasn't a sense of we're in this together. And so I'll start with this little bit of context and then invite my friends to chime in. The 11 simple rules is a framework designed at its core to improve child outcomes and early learning success. However, we believe in our hearts that equity and quality for every child cannot happen until there is equity and quality for every adult. And so these 11 simple rules are a framework for how we all can be in community together. So if I were to ask you all, envision relationships and interactions that are good ones. Forgive me, but forget class, forget everything that you see on PowerPoint slides and in training. Just ask yourself, what does it feel like to be in a good relationship and interaction? And then ask yourself, what does it feel like to be in an emotional and physical environment that makes you want to be with people, makes you want to relate, and makes you want to learn? And what are learning experiences that spark your curiosity? Well, I think adults and children are pretty similar. So what we did was we said, can we get everybody on the same page? Create a framework that's doable and livable for everyone. And we think we've come up with it. Nikki, I'm going to ask you to sort of describe in that beautiful way you have kind of what they are in your mind in a nutshell.
Sure. I love the simple rules because I like to keep things simple. And the way that I think about them is they're just ways of being and relating with one another that feel sensible and right and that are familiar. So it's just something easy for everyone to hold on to.
And Nichole, can I ask you to kind of dig a little deeper and give people the visual of kind of what this framework is?
Sure, Judy. So I think one thing is it is simple, as Nikki said, and that's one of the beauties of it. It's also cohesive and research-based as well. And so it's really a framework to help the adults establish this new and equitable model of working together to promote a shared vision of equity and quality so that children and adults can thrive together. And that is the other beauty of this framework, is that it applies to children in partnership with children, children in partnership with adults, and adults in partnership with adults. And so we are answering the question, what are these 11 simple rules? So in the framework, there is 3 dimensions: relationships and interactions, the physical and emotional environment, and learning experiences. And so for relationships and interactions, we look for those that are open, honest, trusting, and two-way. In the emotional and physical environment, we look for those that are safe, calm, organized, and respectful. And then in the learning experiences, we look for those learning experiences that are meaningful, that are exploratory, and that are actionable. And again, this is children and adults alike. And Rachel, can I pass it to you to talk a little bit about that in Wyoming?
Absolutely. So when we dove into this framework here in Wyoming, up and foremost, it was important that coherence was a part of this, that it was kept logical and consistent. And I think that between the panelists that worked on this, that we definitely achieved that goal. It's definitely not just a tool for educators, it's a resource for families, for counselors, for many different people. It's one of the things I really love about it.
So
I'm sorry, Judy. I have to say, as you all are jumping in and responding to and expanding on each other's thoughts and the responses to just one question, it's already demonstrating this cohesiveness and this how conversations across colleagues and this community discussion really fosters a deeper understanding and a connection across all spectrums of the system.
you know, that's such a heartwarming observation, because I think when Nichole goes into the next question of the why we did it, we'll talk more about that. Before we do, I just want to ask everyone again to do a little visualization. Most of the people on this call are people who have been in professional development learning experiences where we've talked about relationships and interactions. Many of you know that I am a co-author of a book on powerful interactions and coaching with powerful interactions. Most, if not all of you, know how much training we do on relationships and interactions. Picture this instead. Ask everyone in a room, what does a good one look like? Think of someone you hang out with and what do you like about it? And suddenly everybody belongs in the conversation. Everybody has expertise. Everyone has wisdom. And then when you say, let's take a bunch of pictures and let's look at those pictures, everybody has wisdom. And so to us, that's the embodiment of this framework, that it's like a conversation starter. And like this interaction that we're having now, at Leading for Children, our goal is to bring everyone into the conversation.
That's amazing. Thank you. And it reminds me, just yesterday I was in a meeting where they used the term or reference community wisdom and bringing the wisdom of the community together. And it's timely as I see this, what we're doing here today. And a great segue to remind everybody, our community of participants on the webinar right now, to submit questions for our community of panelists to respond to and engage in the dialogue. As we do, though, I want to, as Judy alluded to, connect to our next question here and ask for our group to tell us why Leading for Children developed the framework of 11 simple rules for thriving communities. Kind of heard a little bit of the what, but now why? So Nichole, I would love to start that conversation with you.
Sure, Lauren, I'll be happy to get us started, and then I will definitely pass and ask for my colleagues to share as well. So the idea behind the framework is simple, and that is to promote equity by creating a way to come together around quality early care and education that is in a way that's accessible, meaning, Rachel mentioned that is something that can be used by family members, community members. It can be used, in programs of various types, because children live in all types of environments, so that it can be holdable and inclusive to all. And also because we know how adults interact, deep and lasting influence on the children in their care. Children learn what they live and not just what we say to them. And yet, the early learning field spends very little time focusing on the relationships and interactions among adults. And also, we wanted to co-create communities in which every child can thrive. All the adults in the child's ecosystem need to come together with mutual respect and collaboration and inclusivity for that to happen. And Judy, can I pass to you to pick us up there?
Sure. So I think the why is rooted in the challenge in our field and in the kind of some of the history and patterns of our field. I think for me, I know that when I was a teacher, I drowned in the various initiatives that were sent in my direction as a classroom teacher. And I had trouble, I don't know that I used the word coherence, but I had trouble understanding how all the pieces fit together. And I would be asked to demonstrate intentionality and to demonstrate professionalism. And I tried, but I often felt like I was in a ping pong game. And then in the next phase of my career, as I began to do work as a coach and as a speaker and as a writer about education, I thought, why do we kind of make everything so encumbered? Why is it that we look to make things complex? And so the collision of ideas in my mind put families, practitioners, directors, and agency leaders in a place of sort of perpetual tension, which is the antithesis of the kind of environment we're trying to create for children and families. And so on the one hand, we're asking the adults who support the children in their lives to be certain ways with children. As Nichole said, we haven't focused on how to be with each other, because how do children learn best? By observing us, by modeling. So when I went to blank State Department of Education and saw really, really crowded hallways and really, really crowded offices, and I made a joke one day that Eckers would have a field day scoring all of these people like with horrible scores. We all laughed, and I said, how can we make decisions and policy about children's lives if we're not living it with each other? And so that was the foundation for the why behind not just the 11 simple rules, but Leading for Children, of We have to create a culture among the adults, all the adults. We have to break down the silos. We can't do training of parents and training of teachers, but rather we have to bring people together, creating conversations that foster the feeling of collaborative community in which children can't help but to do well. And that's our why. Nikki and Rachel, you know a lot about the why. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I think I would just add that a statement that Nichole made in a conference when I first became acquainted with Leading for Children, it sort of encapsulates this very well, and it's why I knew that we wanted to partner with Leading for Children. And Nichole just said that we can't offer children a gift that we've never been given. And that has really stood out to us in Wyoming and our team in Wyoming, that's what we've been trying to do, is offer adults the same gift that we want them to offer children.
I think it's important to also say that I felt like this wasn't necessarily training. It was fun to go to. And like Judy has mentioned several times, conversations were had. It wasn't, we didn't come in and this is what you need to do. They were conversations where everybody felt safe to talk and express their views and opinions on what we needed to improve on in Wyoming for our youngest learners.
It's really great to hear you all explain this and the why. Love the statement of offer a gift that we've never been given ourselves. Is a really powerful statement. But also in the four of you sharing and showcasing the why, there's this connection, like Rachel, like you said, it's not just a sit and get where you're just listening to a content or a professional development and then you turn around and walk away. This is an engagement. You are part of the conversation. You are a main player to it. So it's meaningful and it resonates and you turn around and it's already become part of you, is what I'm hearing in this conversation. And it's just amazing to hear.
Can I add one thing, which is we often talk about the inability to separate content and process. In my work as a curriculum developer, I always said about early childhood, you know, the curriculum is the content and the process. And at Leading for Children, the way of being with each other is fundamentally our content. You know, how do we practice being optimistic leaders for children? How do we be together in a space? So the 11 simple rules are a framework to support conversations about thriving communities. We also practice those 11 simple rules in the communities we create with our partners. So one of the things I think that is such an imperative to our work is this idea of modeling and living our belief structure.
And I'd like just to add one thing to that, because Lauren, and I think it connects to what you said, and it connects to the whole framework in the way in which we want to collaborate and be with each other. And that is, we sincerely believe, and by we, I mean all of our colleagues here, we believe that in order to really strengthen systems, we have to recognize that the people within the system, they're the ones with the wisdom and the experience and the solutions to their own challenges. What they get from us is partners that will have these conversations with them and help them to begin to elevate that wisdom. So I do want to say, because that's important to us, that the wisdom is there. The wisdom is in the room, and it's not coming from anybody at the front of the room.
Someone, I know we're going to do Q&A later, but let me just insert a quick comment here. So we developed the 11 simple rules and we tried them out intensively in 2 communities. And we're going to hear from Wyoming next just exactly how they went about it. I really appreciate the question from Catherine. And we call that structure the learning network, and that will unfold a little bit. We also have worked on this in other ways with other communities, which we'll share. And we are a relatively young nonprofit, and our goal is to have a resource about the 11 Simple Rules published in October. So that was just a little insert information for people who are just kind of wondering. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to derail, Lauren.
No, that's perfect. I also saw that question pop up a few times in the chat and the Q&A. So I'm glad that you shared that now. Taking this comment that you all shared of that the wisdom and the importance of the wisdom being in the room and recognizing that the wisdom is in the room, not necessarily at the front of the room. We've talked a little bit about the what, a little bit about the why. So now, as Judy alluded to, I'd love to go into the how. So Nikki, going to ask you to start us off here. And could you please describe how the 11 simple rules can be implemented in a community?
I'd love to. I would just also, to start this off, like to say, I experienced this type of learning opportunity with Leading for Children at an NAOIC Professional Learning Institute. And at that time, I knew that that type of opportunity is what I wanted for educators in Wyoming. And we were lucky enough to receive some federal preschool development grant funds. Wyoming is a state that has never addressed quality formally in early childhood programs. There's a lot of resistance to that in our state. And there's some real good reasons for that, I think, among educators in the state. But as we had the opportunity to try to address quality, what we knew is that something top down, first of all, would fail in Wyoming. And second of all, it wouldn't value the people who matter. As Nichole said, the people who determine quality are the people who are with children every day. And those are also the people who know about quality. And so realizing that our vision for what we wanted to do in Wyoming aligned with Leading for Children, it was a perfect match. And what we did in Wyoming is we created what we called a quality learning network. And we brought in educators and parents, and other professionals in the early childhood field from across the state. We intentionally invited people from communities that are often not represented. So family home childcare providers, infant toddler educators, program leaders in programs that don't receive federal funding or state funding. We just sought out the voices that we think have been historically absent from the table. And we intentionally used our network. Wyoming's a very small state, and we know each other here. And so we were able to reach out to our networks across the state and identify those voices that we knew needed to be at the table and invite them in. So that was the first step, is inviting them in and bringing those people to the table. I think it's really important that that's the first step, but that we know that that can't be, it doesn't just take care of itself at that point. What happens once you get people all seated at that table is that you need to have very intentional facilitation on what happens next, or you just replicate the same challenges in the system that are inequitable. And so that's what I love about Leading for Children, and they can talk about their approach in a quality learning network, is that we're not just doing things the same way with just a few different people at the table. We're really aware about making sure that voices were equitably represented, and that we elevated the voices of the people who typically aren't heard. And primarily our focus was just on those who are in classrooms and in childcare with children every day. Their voices were most important to us. So we set up that. We engaged in a learning network that lasted for about 6 months. And our team's process, really facilitated by Leading for Children, was to think about and discuss these ideas around quality and what it looks like for the people that were there at the table. So what does it look like in Wyoming? What does it mean to have exploratory learning in a classroom in Wyoming? What does that look like? And Wyoming Voices really did shape what the result was from this. So Wyoming in some places said, we actually like this word a little bit better than this word. That represents us a little bit better. Leading for Children embraced that, and we were able to design something together. We were able to produce a final product that truly represented what individuals in Wyoming think is quality for young children. I don't know, Rachel, if you have other thoughts about that process. to
Yeah,
add.
absolutely. Thank you, Nikki. For me, this opportunity came to me my first year teaching, so I was very hungry for some wisdom and eager to learn. And I was very honored to be a part of this framework. I feel like with it still being somewhat new in Wyoming, for me, it's about just starting conversations and staying approachable and curious to others' thoughts on this new resource. And as I said earlier, it's not just for educators. I personally use these 11 simple rules in my everyday life. We were given unlimited copies of this tool, and I was able to distribute it to different people in the community. Some examples, a principal, a local counselor, daycare provider came to the school, has a copy of this. So being a part of this collaboration for me and framework, I was able to come back to my classroom and implement the 11 simple rules. We have been able to create equity in our classroom. Meeting each child and adult at their level of need is very important to us. We started this by building strong relationships with each student and their families. Sorry. Let's see. By building the relationship, the rest of the simple rules seem to just kind of follow behind it like clockwork. One of my favorite examples of transformation from my classroom was that we've changed up our circle time. Circle time used to be completely led by me. I let my curiosity open up the opportunity for the leader of the day to become the student teacher during circle time. It gave the power to the children, and it was a game changer. They were teaching their peers about the letter of the week, the sound it makes, teaching them the shapes, colors, numbers up on our learning tree. And our circle time became exciting, and then they got to choose whichever book that we wanted to read for that afternoon. So just staying curious was huge and a game changer in our classroom. I'd also like to mention that this framework helped a group of educators from Wyoming create our new learning standards for Wyoming. And it has been the Coherent Path to Quality has been, which is this book here, is now a companion tool for our new learning standards here in Wyoming. And I think that that was important to share.
Thank you, Rachel. Every time I hear you talk about your classroom and these rules, it just gets me right there. So thank you for sharing that perspective. And I have so much appreciation for how you always say, well, I came in as a first year teacher, and I just remember those conversations, and you came in with so much wisdom. And I think what really comes to my mind, I can't remember who submitted the photo, but there was a photo of a dad and his daughters. You're nodding, you remember that. And I remember us putting that photo up on the screen and talking about what was being conveyed around trusting and honest and open and two-way, and you really sharing, your perspective about and how that open, honest, trusting two-way moment with her dad, how that was opening her up to learning before she ever stepped foot into a classroom. So I just wanted to say, yes, you came as a new teacher and you came with so much wisdom. And we hear that in you sharing how you're using those 11 simple rules. So thank you for that.
I just took the liberty of Diana asked about the 11 simple rules. And while we said them, of course, without a visual, it's maybe a little hard. So relationships and interactions. The basic 4 rules are open, honest, trusting, two-way. For the emotional and physical environment, safe, calm, organized, respectful. and for learning experiences meaningful, exploratory, and actionable. And they're listed on our website. And if you follow up with with me or Nichole afterwards, we can make sure to share a simple document with you, and stay tuned for October.
Would it be okay if I shared how Wyoming kind of changed some of those words to mold more towards our communities?
Would love that. Actually, Rachel, you are reading my mind, because I was just going to elevate the fact that you talked about how the work that you were doing in the classroom is informing the standards, or did inform the early learning standards, and that truly is the definition of respecting the wisdom in the community. Like Nichole so nicely said, that you brought all this wisdom in as a teacher. So we'd love to see how the state did that.
So for Wyoming, within our 3 dimensions, starting with the relationships and interactions, the words that held true for us were authentic, responsive, reciprocal, and consistent. For the emotional and physical environment, we felt important for it to be safe, respectful, predictable, and accessible. For the learn that they were meaningful, exploratory, and actionable.
One thing I want to say, because I imagine people who are listening are probably wondering, well, that sounds really good when everyone agrees. And what happens when there is an agreement in the room? And I wanted to talk a little about that, because that is the importance of consensus building. And so consensus building is not about who loses and who wins. Consensus building is about having these conversations, applying these rules to the way that we engage and behave with each other, so that we can talk through each other's perspective, and then together build consensus that is needed. And so I just wanted to say that, because when we do have these important conversations, the beauty of it is that we have the wisdom of diverse voices. And the beauty in that too is being willing to have these open, honest, two-way conversations and relationships in an environment that's safe and respectful, in these ways that allow consensus to occur. And so I just wanted to say that, because I would imagine if I was in the audience hearing this, I would go, but what happened? People all didn't have the same perspective. And
One thing that we've done in the last year, so the first project where we did this at a big scale was in Mississippi, and then we did Wyoming, and we piloted what would happen if we accommodated to changing the words. And we're very comfortable and thrilled at the progress that Wyoming has made over this past year, because evidence-based is so critical. We have done expansive research on the 11 simple rules, and in the book that we're publishing in October, there will be a significant research base to the 11 simple rules that I put in the chat. And that research base is for children and for adults, like how that has shown up in the research over many years. And similarly, we are invested in looking at how these simple rules translate to improved social emotional outcomes for adults and improved social emotional outcomes for children. And so I think a task that we have really been working on is supporting communities in beginning with the 11 simple rules and then finding synonyms that allow for that consensus to be built. I think somebody asked about the website and where it's located, and we'll make sure that gets into the chat before we're done. So Lauren, we're going to turn it back to you, because I think you have some more questions.
I do. And this conversation is just, it's so inspiring. I mean, it is motivating and it is inspiring to hear you all talk through this experience, but then also how meaningful it has been for you and for the children and really just the education system as a whole there in Wyoming. We got through the what and a little bit of how, and I'd love to take some of that conversation and dig a little deeper. And as I do, we're seeing some great questions coming in from the audience. So please continue to submit those. We are loving that we get the opportunity to address these. So would like to ask you all, how might these 11 simple rules, or this 11 simple rule framework and process look in other settings? We kind of alluded, kind of touched on it, but would like to see if we can dig deeper into that.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yes, Nikki, why don't you start with other settings in Wyoming, and then we'll go to Mississippi.
Okay, sure. And I think you had mentioned this before. How did this fit with what we did with our standards? And I think what I would say that's beautiful is being with a group of people that have experienced this process. You realize that you now have a generation of leaders. They were already leaders before, but they didn't really have a voice. And once you start building that kind of momentum in a state, you don't want to stop that. And so from preschool development grant, we had the next opportunity was to revise our early learning standards in our state. And we just knew that we needed to apply these simple rules and the same process. To try to do that differently with something like standards was really interesting challenge and a little scary at times. But we held true to the process. We used the same steps that we did before, brought in different individuals that hadn't been at the table with different expertise, different experiences, always focused on the educators that are with children every day. And we did a revision of the standards themselves. And then we created a document that once again was intended to represent the experience and the knowledge and the wisdom of the educators that are working with children. So it's full of stories from Wyoming, similar to our previous work with Leading for Children. We were brave enough to try to do this one on our own, just with like some counsel and conversation with the folks at Leading for Children. And that's the other thing that I think I would just stress is that this builds capacity. So that experience with them built our capacity to try to do our own learning about how to apply this in Wyoming on our own. And I think we're very, very proud of the results. And then just one final statement I would make about that is you create ambassadors for whatever it is, the project that you have just completed, when they're there and they own it. So we have 100 ambassadors for this work in Wyoming after these two projects that want to share and talk about what quality is and how it looks when you're meeting standards in classrooms in Wyoming.
Thank you for that. That was beautiful.
Yeah, I was going to say, in thinking about Mississippi, and one thing I'd like to say too about Wyoming is the podcast, because you haven't mentioned that. And so there is a podcast, Voices of the Village. And so the members of the Learning Network, some of them appeared on the podcast and shared. And so they really are dispersing this throughout the state. In Mississippi, we had a 3-year learning network where we used the 11 simple rules. And as Judy said, that was really where the 11 simple rules were first birthed and piloted. And the thing we wanted to do there was that there was a substantial investment in working with educators. And then when that partnership was over, when the coaches left the programs, they noticed that, there was a little tail off. And so the idea was, what would happen if we brought together all of the voices? So again, we had drivers, we had directors, we had teachers, we had family members, we had community members, and we came together and we had these same types of conversations. We used photos, we used videos. They began to be investigators, would go into their own spaces. We had family members that were talking about playing I Spy in the grocery store with her children, or going upstairs and playing with them. We had, community members that was talking about how they're applying it in their own settings. And so the other thing is, not only do we apply them to our professional settings, but what we found is that they translate so well into personal settings as well. And so what this really does is it creates that consistency in the child's ecosystem. Imagine, if you would, if all of the adults when the child goes to school, when the child comes home, when the child is their family dentist, when the child goes to the community center in their neighborhood. All of the adults are thinking, for relationships, I need to make sure I'm creating ones that are open, honest, trusted, two-way. Imagine how that wraps around the whole child. And so that's really how we're seeing being translated into different places in different spaces.
Lauren, do I have another minute to offer a perspective?
Of course, of course.
So at the beginning, I said that one of the key motivations for starting Leading for Children and for developing the Coherent Path, or the 11 Simple Rules, is to change the narrative in early learning. And I'm going to tell a really quick story. About 10 years ago, a director in a small faith-based program told me that more than anything else, she wanted to get her program accredited for NAEYC. And she said, and I just don't know how to do it. And I said, and I was on the board of this program. And this was the origin story of the 11 Simple Rules. And I said, Miss So-and-so, I'd like a couple weeks to come to your program. She said, my teachers never speak up in workshops. You know, they have a lot to say, but they're very shy, and they're particularly shy around new people. And I said, well, let me just try. And I walked around and I took photographs of moments of effectiveness in every classroom. And what I did was, with no bullet points, with nothing, I simply put the photo up on the screen and I said, turn and talk. What do you notice? Think about the decisions that got made here. And there was so much animation in the room. Every person talked. The director said to me at the end of the day, I've never seen that before. And I said, because the power was with them. It was their moments of effectiveness and their wisdom about those moments of effectiveness. And what she told me was there was more interaction among teachers in the following 2 weeks as they walked into each other's classrooms, which they had never done before, to get ideas and to exchange strategies. There was no competition. There was just a spirit of collaboration. Similarly, I then worked in a huge program in Hawaii. And what I did in that program was bring together people across all roles in a huge agency. And we did the same thing. We said, what's a good one look like? And parents were involved and everybody was involved. And so this idea of how do I do it? The process is what matters. It's not the 11 simple rules. It's that the 11 simple rules give us a starting point. They give us a conversation starter of saying, when you think about a two-way relationship at home, in the grocery store, wherever it is, oh, well, you say the person's name and you smile at them and you ask them how they are. And suddenly everybody's wisdom is in the table or on the table. And so questions like, you know, can I have it to share it with others? Well, yeah, that's why we're putting it out there, but you can't put it out there without making the space for the process. Thank you, Lauren.
Well, thank you, because that actually brings in a question that we had from the audience, and it very much through this last few minutes of our conversation and looking at this as this process that you are explaining, and that the focus is on that process, and seeing how many people we have joined with us listening in. What is a challenge or a good next step that you would give participants, task them with, charge them with, to utilize the 11 simple rules? Like, what is something that they could turn around after this webinar and do to start moving in this direction that you all keep speaking
I
of?
think everybody on this call has an idea, but who would like to start?
I will start. And so, I mean, the obvious answer, of course, would be you could go to the Leading for Children's website, and that is true. And also, though, I think my tip would be is take note of what's happening around you. Maybe after an interaction, pause and ask yourself, what about that interaction was honest or open or trusting or two-way? Or maybe look in the environment around you and notice, what about this is organized? And what does it being organized? What's the impact of that for me? What happens because this space is organized? So that's where I would say start with noticing what is happening around you, because the premise is not that none of us are doing these things. The premise is that we're all doing some of these things, and we can come to consensus and do them with greater intentionality, understanding its impact. And I will pass it to whoever would like to go next.
I would say from me, a good starting point would just to be start taking those photos and start reflecting on everyday practice that, whether it's at home or work, in the community. And I think that that's a great way to start, is just start reflecting.
And of course, I would say, reach out to us for conversation. At the same time, I think one of the easiest of the simple rules and one of the most important, whether it's reciprocal or two-way, because they kind of mean back and forth. And I would invite some people to be on a Zoom call and for 20 minutes, make sure it's a bunch of different kinds of people and say, today, let's talk about what a two-way relationship is. Kids to kids, adults to kids, adults to each other at home, at school, at work. What are all the words you think about when you think about two-way? And you can use, what's that word cloud gimmick, that poll everywhere, or you can use the whiteboard on a Zoom meeting and just get everybody thinking about what two-way looks like. And then have 3 photographs, one of an adult and adult together, one of an adult and a child in a classroom, and one of an adult and a child at home. And say, let's look at those photos and what makes them two-way. And that's just the most lovely way to have a conversation and have every voice heard. At Leading for Children, we use a technique called the carousel. And what that means is everybody looks, everybody thinks, everybody writes down their idea, and then everybody has a turn. And instead of saying, Rachel took my idea, I trust that the idea that I wrote down, even if it's similar, my texture and Rachel's texture are going to enrich our ideas. And that's how we would suggest you get started.
Nikki?
Yeah, I think I would just hop in with, I think there's a lot of really smart people on this call. And one of the things we're good at is identifying problems, challenges that we see in the system, in our classrooms or with others. And for me, a suggestion would be, when we identify a problem, let's think about the people that are most impacted by that problem, or who can have the greatest impact in helping solve that problem. And let's just make sure their voices are at the table. And then let's engage in a process of learning together. Another thing we're doing in Wyoming is we're trying to support the transition to kindergarten. And we're working in pilot communities to bring all those voices to the table, engaged in two-way conversation where everyone's a learner. It's equitable because everyone's learning together and everyone's voices are equal. And then communities are coming up with their own ideas about how to better support children in their communities in their transition to kindergarten. The wisdom is in the room. You just need to get the right people in the room.
A couple of people have asked Lauren for a one-pager, and we do have on our website a description of the 11 simple rules, but we'll take responsibility. Our Facebook page is Leading for Children, and we can put a PDF on our Facebook page tomorrow. We can also share it with you, and you can put it with the recording.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yes, we have started here at the Hunt Institute after our webinars. because we have such great engagement and conversation. We don't want it to just disappear. So after our webinars, our team puts together a key takeaways and a little mini blog to complement the webinar and the recording. So you can come back and watch this conversation, share it with others, and then visit these resources that we have mentioned and had in the chat. It's really hard to imagine that our time is coming to an end, but before we do conclude this webinar, we have really started kind of initiating this idea that we'd love to end our webinars on a positive note. And so as we wrap up this afternoon, I'd like to pose one last question, asking you to provide each maybe a 30-second or so response to leave us all on a kind of happy, well-wished note here. So the question I'd like to pose is, as we look ahead, what is your greatest hope for young children and the adults in their lives? And Rachel, why don't we start with you as you come to us from your classroom?
Oh, it's a big question, especially nowadays with everything going on in our world. I would say that every child and adult have the opportunity to thrive in equitable communities that foster a safe, equitable school and classroom for all. It's my hope that every child has at least one adult in their life that's going to cheer them on and be there for them. I will pass it on to Nikki.
Thanks, Rachel. I think my greatest hope is that there are some things we know that work, and it's when you trust in a process and you trust in relationships with others and you remain curious in your learning. Solutions to all kinds of problems will result from that kind of process. So I'm a believer in the process above everything. Nichole, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll jump in next. I think what I want most for children and adults as we move ahead is for them to know that they are enough, for them to grow up in a world and a community that knows that they are enough. And that because they know they are enough, that they have the capacity to know that they can solve any problem and that they can affect change in the world around them. Judy, I'll pass it to you.
Well, I believe that children need models to be able to do that. And so I would ask every person here and then tell 10 people to own your role and impact as a leader for children, regardless of your title, and that we model that leadership for children and that we do it in a way that recognizes and promotes optimism.
Wonderful. Wisdom, curiosity, respect, optimism, community, modeling, affecting change, and owning our impact. I couldn't think of anything better to end a webinar on. Rachel, Nikki, Nichole, Judy, thank you so much for a fabulous conversation, a community discussion today. Definitely needed, definitely well resonated. We all very much appreciate this. Those listening in, look for our follow-up. We will have our blog and our takeaways. We will have all that we have discussed connected back to resources for you to utilize and take away and use starting immediately. I thank you again, everyone who has joined us today. We very much appreciate you taking part with our Early Efforts webinar series and invite you all to join in our next one. June 8th, we have a special series with Bank Street on career pathways of strengthening the expertise of the early childhood workforce, timely to follow a conversation like today. And then June 22nd, we have a webinar on strong foundations, inclusive pre-K settings. Thank you again, everyone.
Lauren.
We appreciate all of you on this call. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.